Hi, thanks, welcome. I'll add my welcome to Amy's. I am Michael Oettinger, as Amy indicated, the director of the Carsey School of Public Policy, which is kind of arising out of the Carsey Institute, which I know many of you are familiar with. It's an exciting time for us, time of change, of growth, of sort of new challenges. I think part of the rising out of the Carsey Institute is we're thinking about new areas of research we can go into, expanding our public engagement, and most notably, or noticeably, expanding our academic offerings, which we think will be headed towards offering a Master's of Public Policy degree. One of the hallmarks of what we're thinking about in terms of the academic offerings is really a focus, the traditional focus on training people to have, top-notch research skills to be able to analyze our society's problems as well as develop policy solutions for those problems, but also really looking at how to make change, how to actually take those solutions and make them happen. All too often I hear anyway, well, we know the answer, we know how to solve this problem, but it's just politics getting in the way. Well, then you don't know the answer if that's where you're stuck. And so, I think that an important part of what we want to offer is thinking about how do you actually make change, how do you actually make a difference, how do you actually make either government step in or the for-profit world or the nonprofit world to really make the changes that the research identifies as being the changes that would benefit society. Which makes Dan Weeks here particularly appropriate. Dan is studying poverty, and which has been a hallmark of what the Carsey Institute has looked at. And Dan is also, though, looking at very much the politics of it and what are the barriers to actually addressing poverty. So let me introduce Dan. Dan is a fellow at the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University and executive director of Open Democracy, a nonprofit, nonpartisan group working to expand political voice and participation in New Hampshire. He is the former president of Americans for Campaign Reform, and he works on education in low-income communities at City Year. Of particular importance for his talk today, and you'll hear more about this, is that in 2012 and 2013, Dan traveled across the United States for 6 weeks on, it says a Greyhound bus. I assume it was more than one Greyhound bus. Okay, so in Greyhound buses on a below poverty line budget of $16 per day to try to see firsthand how the challenges of Americans' poorest populations affect their ability to have a voice in the democratic process. And his experiences and subsequent research are going to be the subject of a report that Carsey is publishing this fall. So I think whether you agree or disagree with Dan or Dan's conclusions, I think you're going to find him thought-provoking and provocative in the good sense of that word as he describes his findings and experiences looking at the relationship between poverty, policy, politics, and power. So, Dan?
Good evening. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Amy, and everyone here at the Carsey Institute for this enormous privilege of being here for the first public event of the new Carsey School of Public Policy. I think I'm hearing two mics, so why don't I put this one to the side? Does that make sense? Sure. All right. Raise your hand if there are any sound issues. But it's a great privilege to be here. I want to also thank the Rudman Center at UNH Law in Concord, which co-sponsored the talk, as well as the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, which provided fellowship support for this research. Michael mentioned that I spent some time on the road on Greyhound buses, and so I want to start there. Let me begin with poverty. I wonder what comes to mind for you when you hear that word, faces or adjectives that come to mind. If you're anything like me, you may think of someone like Troy under the bridge in New Orleans, somebody who's had a rough break since Hurricane Katrina, who's homeless and jobless, dealing with substance addictions. Maybe you think of someone like Louise from deep rural Appalachia in Arkansas, self-described white trash with barely a grade school education. Or maybe you think of someone like Richard in Montgomery, Alabama, a young man who, by outer appearances, made some wrong decisions, got caught up in the wrong crowd, and broke the law, spent some time in jail, and now he's out of jail, jobless, homeless, trying to get back on his feet. I want to start with Richard in Montgomery, Alabama. This was early in my first Greyhound trip through the American South, fall of 2012, and I should say I was pretty excited to be in Montgomery. I've read a lot about Martin Luther King and the bus boycotts, Rosa Parks, and I was hoping that I would see in Montgomery the positive legacies of that work. One thing I discovered on my travels is that the Greyhound stations are typically situated far out of town. So if you'll walk with me for a moment, I arrived on this particular October morning on an overnight bus from New Orleans. One of the tricks I learned on $16 a day is it's best to be safe and warm overnight, since you can't necessarily get into a hotel. So I rode the bus a lot of overnights, and I had just arrived there in Montgomery, made my way into town, discovered that it was actually several miles into town, so I had a bit of a morning walk after trying to catch some more sleep on the floor of the station. What I saw in Montgomery was a lot of cars that actually came out of the MLK era, you might say. A lot of homes that looked like they hadn't gotten much paint since then. A lot of potholes, a lot of dirt drives. And as I finally made my way into town, it was about lunchtime. I was hungry, and I noticed a shelter, and knocked on the door. A lovely lady, Mama Donna, she was called, a church lady who runs this shelter, without asking any questions, ushered me into the kitchen, deposited a huge plate of Southern Comfort food in front of me, sat me down, and I wasn't about to say no. Spent a couple of hours at this shelter, and Richard was one of the guys I met. Over a game of chess, in fact. And as I started to ask his story, and the reason I want to tell you a little more about Richard at the start here is because this, for me, crystallized the conception of poverty, how I had previously seen poverty much of my growing up years, and how I want to argue we should see it today and its connection to politics. So Richard told me a bit about his life, and I can't possibly do justice to him here, but Richard was someone who, in his words, had a pretty good childhood. He was raised by a single mom, moved between a lot of different homes in poverty. His dad was a military guy who just wasn't cut out to be a dad, as he said, so wasn't part of the story. Didn't really fit in school. The school happened to be, like a lot of Montgomery schools, a lot of schools in low-income parts of this country, one where roughly half of the kids graduate, and he was one of that half that didn't make it through high school. Not really feeling at home in school, he started hanging with the wrong crowd. As he says, he would wear his pants low, he'd play the music loud, and the police in Montgomery didn't take kindly to that, so he was picked up a couple of times, developed a criminal record. After a couple of times in and out for petty offenses, he decided he was going to make another go at it, and he managed to enroll in Job Corps, nearly completed his training as an electrician, but on the final test, as he told me, they told him to scale the telephone pole. Trouble is, Richard's afraid of heights, as he said, and he just couldn't do it. They failed him on the test, and he kind of gave up at that point, spiraled down, started robbing stores with some friends, and as he says, he was lucky that in the end the police picked him up, robbing a store before he could do much harm to himself or another person. And he served 3.5 years in federal penitentiary. Now he's out, and back to our game of chess at this shelter in Montgomery. As you can imagine, I'm comparing a bit of his story. Richard's about my age to my own story and to my own conception growing up, having, you might say, picked the right parents, born in these parts in New Hampshire, one of the wealthiest states in the wealthiest country on earth, white and male. I'm imagining my own conception of poverty as something which was largely individually construed, kind of like those individuals, Troy under the bridge or Louise from Appalachia, a bunch of poor decisions that people make which land them in the place they are. And conversely, the good place where I found myself on that day in Montgomery was naturally the result of good decisions that I had made. But there was something Richard said at the end of our chess game as I was preparing to leave and explore more of the city that really put a point on this for me. Richard said, as I was getting ready to leave, whatever you do, this was a piece of advice he was giving you, whatever you do, he said, don't fly a sign. And I was still pretty green in my travels. I didn't even know what he meant, so he must have seen the confusion in my face. And he said, don't ask for money. Because if you do, he said, the police will pick you up and you won't get out. You'll be in for days or even weeks. The police don't take kindly to poor people here. And so I left with this admonition feeling a little bit scared. I wasn't planning to fly a sign, but I thought I might get comfortable on a bench downtown, but he had said that was not a good idea. And so as I began to explore and ask around in Montgomery and in the other cities I traveled, through 30 states over 6 weeks, as Michael mentioned, I found that most of our big cities have these kinds of ordinances criminalizing homelessness and other forms of poverty. And that many of the people I asked there in Montgomery described stories. One guy asking for 50 cents outside of a gas station had been picked up and spent 21 days in jail. Maurice. Another guy, Eric, who I ended up spending that night with on the far outskirts of town at a homeless camp. We were careful not to be in town where the police would take notice. He described a friend of his. I couldn't verify this friend, but apparently this young kid had stolen a loaf of bread from the Walmart store in Montgomery and spent 10 months in jail before he got his date in court. He got out of jail. He climbed a Greyhound bus and got out of town. So hearing these stories made it pretty clear to me that there was more than some poor choices going on in these people's lives. That both Richard and I had made some poor choices in life, but the consequences of those were vastly different. Hence the institutional or the political dimensions of poverty. And that's what I want to get into now. Democracy, politics. I want to argue in the next several slides here that poverty is in fact a democracy problem, or to be more precise, a lack of democracy problem in our country. And I want to look at three, what I argue are political or democracy poverty traps. Three dimensions of politics where we are, I argue, systematically excluding low-income people from a political voice in order to change the kinds of ordinances and other laws and the strict enforcement of those that I saw in Montgomery and other places. And for each of these, I want to give you another little glimpse from my travels. So let's start with this first political poverty trap, the voting system. Let me introduce you to MJ Maria Elena Johnson from Chaparral, an unincorporated colonia on the Texas-New Mexico border. Unincorporated meaning it's not officially a town. It doesn't have any public services. Most of the roads are unpaved. There's no gas or water, even though there's some 20,000 people who live there. A glimpse of Chaparral. Most of the homes are something like this. As you can imagine, as you might have seen, MJ is Mexican-American, and her parents, not actually her parents, but the couple who raised her, Andy and Maria, were born in Mexico. They came here when they were kids, have lived most of their lives here, have worked here. Most of their years, their combined 170-odd years, they're both getting on in age. They were illegally here, but working whatever jobs they could get. And to begin with here, the voting system, MJ's parents and a good many others don't have citizenship, and so naturally they cannot vote. And as we see here, moving from income bracket lower to higher, the rate of citizenship is considerably lower for people in poverty. But when we move to registration and voting, the disparities based on income grow much wider still. Resident aliens, like MJ's parents, Andy and Maria, have ballooned in numbers. These are non-citizens, adults of voting age in the U.S. from roughly 4 million in 1980 to 16 million, fourfold increase today. Who are the disenfranchised people in terms of income? When I look across various groups of disenfranchised people, we find that most of those who are legally disenfranchised as citizens, putting aside for a moment non-citizens who lack the right to vote, are in poverty, whereas those who vote, roughly 1 in 10 is poor. And to go back for just one moment, another group of disenfranchised citizens to take us back to Richard are those with felony convictions. Roughly 6 million Americans have been convicted of a felony and are disenfranchised as a result. Of those 6 million, 2/3 have finished serving their sentence. But in many states, in the South and other places, one is disenfranchised for life. So, as you can imagine, people trapped in the criminal justice system are much more likely to be poor and thus to be disenfranchised in cases like Richard for many years after serving time. The second trap I want to briefly discuss is what I call simply the campaign system. And I want to look at volunteering and becoming active in campaigns as well as funding campaigns, a topic that I've particularly worked on in recent years. Cassandra, here in Cincinnati, Ohio, works for something called the Contact Center. She's a self-described welfare mom. Says she couldn't have gotten through the 80s and 90s raising her kids without welfare, but that changed significantly in 96, and so she's had a tough time getting by. But why do I put her under the campaign system? Well, she's a bit unique. Of the many people I interviewed, she's one of the few who decided she was going to be politically active, whatever the barriers. And so she wanted to be active in campaigns. The volunteering rates, as you can imagine, like the voting and registration rates, skew considerably based on income. And so looking by socioeconomic status, a composite of income and wealth, from 2008, you see that the lowest income quintile and education quintile here are much less likely to be active in politics than those at the top. Aspects like campaign work, like giving money, like doing community work and contacting elected officials, these are all things that Cassandra was committed to doing and still tries to do today. But when she described the interactions that she's had at the State House or at City Hall, she finds that poor people just don't feel comfortable there. Even when she persuades them to come, even when she can raise some money to bus them up to Columbus, to the state capitol, she finds that it's not a happy experience and few people come back. And so one can understand why perhaps these various modes of campaign engagement skew so much based on income. It's just outside of their plausibility framework, as she described it to me. When it comes to funding campaigns, as one can imagine, a participation mode that is based entirely on money, the disparities are much wider still. We find, looking at the disclosures of campaign contributions to federal elections, only about 2% of Americans make campaign contributions, and those are, by definition, people with the means to write a donation to a political candidate. Of that 2%, a much smaller 0.4% make meaningful donations, itemized donations of larger than $200. And when you look at the percentage of the total money given that comes in large and small amounts, we see that fully 2/3, almost 2/3 of the money given comes in large amounts of more than $2,500, and just 14% comes in small amounts of less than $200. So within that slice of 2% of the American population, a tiny fraction, in fact, a single individual, Sheldon Adelson in 2012, gave more money to politics than 98% of the country combined. Let me move to a final political poverty trap, the pressure system or the lobbying system in Washington. And here I turn to a local guy, Vinny, a computer programmer by trade, who made the mistake. His girlfriend, he said to me, I couldn't verify this story, but he said that she unfortunately has been addicted to prescription drugs for some time. And we know the rates are unfortunately quite large in New Hampshire and other parts of the country. They were driving together one day. The police pulled them over and found these prescription drugs, and both of them were sentenced for a year in state prison here in New Hampshire. When I interviewed him at the Soup Kitchen in Concord, it was just a few months after his release, and he hadn't yet found work. But I speak about him in terms of the pressure system because he, like Cassandra, was trying to exert some pressure. As some of you may have read, last year in Concord, the police and the local authorities cracked down on homeless people's ability to camp on public lands. And Vinny, at this particular lunch where I interviewed him, we were talking with a small group of other homeless people who were trying to plot a strategy to push back against this law. They had all been fined and had not paid their fines, and so they were expected to appear in court. Trouble was they didn't have a lawyer, they didn't have a lobbyist, and they weren't quite sure what they were going to do. As a sidebar, the ACLU in New Hampshire has taken on this issue, and there's been some encouraging movement. But certainly as we sat at the table that day, there was little sense that they would be able to overcome this challenge. Still, they had to try. This is, I think, a small example of the enormous disparities we see in the pressure system in Washington. And looking for the most recent disclosures on lobbying from 2012, beginning with the issues that are represented in legislation introduced in Congress, I find that a majority of the bills apply to business interests in Washington, whereas a small percentages apply to the general public interest. These are environmental laws or education programs, things like that. And still smaller percentages apply specifically to unions and to low-income people. Moving from issues to clients, those who hire lobbyists as well as the lobbyists who are hired, I find that 3/4 of the activity in lobbying is accounted for by business and much smaller percentages by these other groups. And then finally, the actual dollars spent in this pressure system in Washington, close to $9.10 are spent by business, which is roughly 1,000 times the amount of spending on behalf of lower income Americans. For a quick rundown, 1998 to 2012, we see that various sectors, primarily business sectors, account for billions of dollars. Most of that, nearly 90% of that total spending of $35 billion over the last several years. And finally, if I go back a little further to 1980, the growth in the pressure system in Washington, business interests account for 92% of the new interest groups that have been added to the lobbying process in Washington, while those advocating on behalf of poor people have grown just 3%. Where do we go from here? I want to bring it back to this notion that poverty, yes, is an economic challenge, is a social challenge, but is also a democracy challenge. And if so, it requires a democracy response. Many of you will be familiar with the work a half-century ago of Michael Harrington on poverty in America, critical to inspiring the war on poverty. And Michael Harrington argued that at that time, the poor were invisible to American society. I think there is too much truth to that still today, but I think we face a somewhat different challenge in the days of social media and TV exposés, namely that the poor are silent, by and large, in politics today. And so what could we do if that is true, if they are systematically underrepresented in each of these major forms of political participation? What could we do to counteract this from a democracy standpoint? We can't possibly do justice to that question here, but let me throw out a few ideas. To begin with, a paradigm shift in how we approach democratic reform. As many know, the Supreme Court has taken a hard line on this notion of money being the same as speech, which naturally enables the translation of economic power into political power in violation of democratic principles. What if, as a response to that, granting the realities of the current Supreme Court, we were to take a more speech approach to this challenge of free speech and enfranchisement? And so to briefly apply this principle of more speech to the three traps that I discussed, when it comes to voting, I'd argue that full enfranchisement should be the norm through automatic registration of every citizen when you turn 18, through automatic restoration of voting rights for felons once they complete their sentence, and the option, as is practiced next door in Vermont and Maine, of allowing prisoners to vote. That also happens to be the norm in other advanced democracies around the world. A full enfranchisement model, a more speech approach to voting, would also mean that any barrier to voting that isn't necessary to ensure the integrity of the ballot would be removed. And so no excuses absentee and early voting. In most of our peer nations, voting takes place on a holiday or a weekend or over an extended period of time. These kinds of approaches would be necessary if we were to assume that voting is a responsibility that ought to be practiced by all. And finally, with respect to voting, I see no reason why people who have completed felony sentences should be disenfranchised, as mentioned, but also those living in the District of Columbia and in Puerto Rico and the other territories who lack voting representation in Congress, why they should not have that representation. And a final note on voting, although this would be probably very unpopular today, I argue that we should consider extending the franchise to non-citizens, which was in fact the practice for most of our first 150 years as a nation, when over 40 American states allowed non-citizens to vote, at least at the local and state level. No court has found that to be unconstitutional, and a couple of cities in Maryland allow non-citizens to vote today. Applying this more speech framework to campaigning, I'd argue that when it comes to funding campaigns, we should be profoundly concerned with where that money comes from and with the fact that 0.4% of the public accounts for most of the money funding politics. A simple approach would be to vastly expand the base, the pool of money from which candidates draw through a public matching system on small donations or through vouchers or tax credits to thereby incentivize citizens to directly fund political campaigns and make it economically viable for them. That would mean that candidates aren't spending the reported 70 or 80% of their time raising money from a select few, generally out-of-state donors, but rather spending their time appealing to a broad public, since every citizen is able to vote with dollars, if you will. And finally, applying this more speech framework to the lobbying and pressure system in Washington, what if we were to, even as we recognize the free speech rights of businesses and other groups to lobby the government, what if we established a public protector of sorts, like I'm familiar with in South Africa, responsible for monitoring legislation as it advances and for proactively enabling low-income constituencies that are affected by legislation to come and lobby, to petition the government in different ways. This could be a public function if we were concerned with ensuring that in the making of our laws, every American was in some way represented. I've gone through a lot. I want to close and look forward to the conversation, but let me just close by bringing this back to the travels, because it's important to think of the broad systemic reforms. I think it's also important to remember the human dimension of these challenges. And so I want to return to MJ, who I pictured earlier. When I interviewed her about 18 months ago in Chaparral, New Mexico, she was a substitute teacher earning $800 a month. A couple of months later, she put in her name as a candidate for state legislature in New Mexico. She described the 2012 election where the folks in Chaparral had spent 4 hours in line waiting to vote because the state had neglected to properly staff their polling place. She is going to be sure that that doesn't happen this year. And if the reports that she's recently shared from New Mexico are true, I think she might just be the next state rep there in Chaparral. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. What do legislators get paid in New Mexico? Is this a path out of poverty?
It's a little more than $100 in New Hampshire.
Okay. So perhaps you'll do a little bit better. So Amy, are we distributing cards? So if people have questions, just as Amy said, just for the video purposes, we're going to distribute cards. Write out your questions on the cards, and I will recite them. And by the way, if people have questions, Amy, feel free to collect them as they go, and I'll mix them in with whatever questions I might have. So actually, it's probably not the most important thing, but the thing that I least knew that you said was that I had no idea that non-citizens could vote in such, on such a wide scale, at earlier times in our country. I wasn't aware of that. So to ask a mundane question, how did you dress on this trip? I assume it wasn't like this.
Not exactly. There felt like a little bit of an irony as I was dressing up for tonight.
We could have gone.
But my wife is here, so I've got to try to look sharp sometimes. As you can imagine, the method of research, participant observation, was one which relied on my ability to relate as best I could to the folks I interviewed. I happened to buy most of my clothes from thrift stores, so that wasn't much of a problem. Not shaving was easy to adapt to. And so the interesting thing that I did discover, wearing regular plain clothes, figuring I fit in more or less, on the whole, the thing that gave me away every time was actually my teeth. People were pretty suspicious of just what I had been through because I've had the good fortune of having good dental care my whole life.
You weren't poor or British.
That's true. But otherwise, it was pretty casual.
All right. So what motivated you to do this, to hit the road? And how long again were you
I conducted 3 trips of roughly 2 weeks each, about 6 weeks, through 30 states. Mm-hmm. The motivation, shortly before getting approval to do this research, I had submitted a proposal to the Safra Center at Harvard to sit at my desk for a year and research alternative methods of campaign finance reform. Sounds like a real exciting project, doesn't it? My wife and I were living in South Africa at the time. As I mentioned, I grew up around here, count myself very privileged, stable circumstances. Although we were sort of poverty light, that is, my parents didn't earn a lot of money. They both had college degrees, and generations before them had gone to college. So there was never any question that I would go to college. Hence, my conceptions of poverty were rather impoverished, I would say. Going to South Africa, whereas as folks who've traveled in the less developed countries will know, poverty is a lot more in your face. It's a lot harder to deny. In Cape Town, where we lived for 2 years, we'd be greeted at most of the stoplights by people asking for spare change. We'd have folks knock at our gate a couple times a week asking for food or clothing. And so I think it was the accumulation of those experiences, 8,000 miles from home, that shortly after I had submitted this proposal to be funded for the research, I said, please ignore what I submitted. I had sort of a middle of the night moment where I said, I can't possibly sit at my desk and do this. I've got to get out and try to better understand poverty in my own country. And so the idea of the Greyhound buses kind of occurred to me one night, and I rewrote my proposal, and fortunately they were willing to accept it.
Yeah, I was in Delhi, I guess April of 2013, and I remember, like, on the flight home, just think, and I had the privilege of meeting with some people who were really working in impoverished communities, which is a good hunk of the country there, and it's like, okay, this is the real stuff,
Yeah.
It really changed my perception, as similar experience as well.
I will say, as I alluded previously, a lot of places I visited seemed not nearly as different from the townships in Cape Town than I'd expected. And I mentioned Louise, who to this day, the family she comes from in Appalachia in Arkansas doesn't have running water or electricity, and she had barely a grade school education. So there's there's more of that than I was expecting to find.
Yeah. So what was there anything that particularly surprised you?
I'd say that I went into the research figuring that the kind of formal barriers to participation. I knew a lot about the money, and obviously people on a poverty budget can't fund campaigns. But I figured that the formal barriers to voting were somewhere around here, and I concluded that they were more like up here. I didn't think 6 million American citizens are disenfranchised, most of them because of a felony conviction, most of them having finished their terms. I had never really paid attention to D.C. and the territories not having voting representation, another roughly 5 million. And so it was those formal barriers, as well as the many testimonies I heard from people about the informal barriers to getting to the poll. Someone like Wendy in Cincinnati, who I interviewed just after she had attempted to go and vote early. They had said there was a discrepancy with her birth date. She said, how could there be? I know my birthday. Maybe she'd gotten the month and date entered in the wrong way or something. But they'd said, sorry, come back next election. And as she reported to me, well, damn it, this was the first time I tried. Didn't work. Enough of this voting business. I'm never going to think about it again. And so a lot of these little hurdles that are quite unnecessary, that were much more widespread than I expected.
So one thing, implicit in what you were saying is that if the poor were more engaged or played a bigger role in politics, that something would be different for them. But you didn't really flesh out how you would see that happening. What is it that would be different?
Well, the beauty and the challenge of a democracy is that we don't predict the outcomes. We trust the process, ensuring that everybody can participate in the process. What I can say is that I didn't cite it here, but in the publication that's forthcoming, I look at some of the recent, very interesting research done by far more credible political scientists than I could ever be, folks like Martin Gilens at Princeton, who've done a wide-ranging analysis of looking at the different policy preferences of people lower or higher on the income ladder, and looking at how those are represented in actual policy outcomes. And so we find, generally speaking, that poor people are much more liberal in their economic policies, not too surprising, are often somewhat more conservative in their social outlook than a lot of progressives. But certainly when it comes to economics, their views on something like the minimum wage, job policy, labor policies, the labor movement are pretty different from what we tend to see in Washington. And Gilens and others document this in the kind of headline that comes out of Gilens' work is that when low-income people and even middle-income people have different preferences to the affluent Americans, the former groups win zero basically never. When it's a contest between rich and poor, the poor have their way in policies almost all of the time. And
the rich have the way.
Thank you. The opposite.
I assume.
Yes, that is.
That would kind of undermine your thesis.
Rich people get their way.
Yeah. I think we have no dearth of questions. So I actually jotted down while you were talking because some things do happen. I mean, it's been my experience in dealing with wealthy people that there is a charitable impulse in many, and I sort of jotted down, like in recent years, things that have happened legislatively that have been supportive of lower income people. EITC expansion, the Affordable Care Act certainly. The Recovery Act had a lot of things in for low-income people, and even the sequestration measures. It was interesting because that carved out a lot of programs for low-income people weren't subject to the sequestration in the federal budget. So there's clearly is there is some charitable impulse that sort of it isn't purely about power. Which is one thing I was thinking about, and I think just glancing through this gets at some of these questions. there's a chicken. It seems like there's a chicken and egg thing here in a way, in the sense that you could work to, you sort of need power to change the system, but you need power to change the system, but you don't have that power, so you can't change the system, so you can't get the results you want. I mean, why do you think, you had a nice litany of things that you would like to see happen? If people aren't empowered, why do we think those would happen? And are people better off spending their energy trying to make those, sort of structural reforms versus just advocating for better conditions for the poor?
This has been a riddle for me for some years, and I'm sure there are a lot of thoughts here, and I'd love to hear thoughts afterward. Strategically, if one considers these problems to be problems, wants to see something done about them, what kind of approach ought we to take? For a couple of reasons, I want to suggest that the structural reform is really worth our while and worth more attention than we're giving it, although certainly it does get, I think, increasing attention these days. Yeah. For one, Americans will naturally disagree on substantive policy interventions. Should we have more food stamps or less? What should we do with welfare, for instance? But I don't think any American can disagree with the notion that everybody ought to have a voice in a democracy, that government should be of, by, and for the people. And it seems to me pretty irrefutable that we are falling far short of that standard. And so at least when it comes to the battle of ideas, it seems to me that this is an idea that, framed correctly, cannot lose. Now, can we then implement it? I don't know. What I am very interested in and committed to trying to do as someone who's been in the democracy movement for a long time, working on campaign finance reform in particular, is to see whether, instead of framing that issue as in abstract terms, let's all be for a better functioning democracy. I'm sure we'd all agree, but I don't know if we'd all get up in the morning fired up about that. Can we put more of a human face on this challenge? And that was really what motivated me, in addition to it was the human impressions that I gained in South Africa in particular, and a desire to make this issue of money in politics more real. And so, we've seen in the movements for progressive change in the past, I alluded to civil rights, there has always been a profound moral human element. And I am deeply concerned that we inspire or motivate similar kind of campaigning here, to see these abstract structural issues as questions of right and wrong, of where we ought to be as a country, and like with civil rights, a quick comparison, if I may, Texas for many years had a whites-only primary. You couldn't vote, you couldn't pick the candidates unless you were white. Today, I'd argue we have a wealth primary, where those who effectively pick the candidates, who then get voted on by the general public, if you have the right to vote, are that 0.4% of the public. And so I think if we can put more of that human face on these structural challenges, hopefully in the process encourage more of a moral kind of campaign, maybe like civil rights, we can address it.
Okay, so this question is it's a good segue to this question, which is, what avenues to campaign finance reform can you imagine? So a constitutional amendment, legislation, big sort of popular organizing efforts. I'm paraphrasing this, but how do you see a path to that? Having both your recent experiences and having worked in sort of the democracy area.
I got started in campaign finance reform in the 90s thanks to Granny D, who lived in the town next door, and spent probably the first 10 years or so of campaigning trying to take the inside path. With Americans for Campaign Reform, we were all about D.C., trying to out-lobby the lobbyists on this issue, trying to mobilize the money and the resources to run a smart inside operation. In the time that I was doing it, the Supreme Court handed down Citizens United and other decisions. So it was probably a good idea that I left because it was just getting worse while I was there. But I have become pretty convinced that to try to beat them at their game is probably not the right approach. And so something like a constitutional amendment, which is very unlikely to pass in the foreseeable future, although it did get an historic 54 votes in the Senate a couple of weeks ago, to the extent that can serve as an organizing tool which leverages what I see to be the one significant advantage, relative asset that the democracy movement has, namely people outside Washington, fed up, enraged with the system. To the extent that the constitutional amendment or other reforms can mobilize that, I think that's the way to go, because I don't think we're going to win inside Washington. Politicians, although many of them say they hate raising money, it's a pretty demeaning part of the job. At the end of the day, it gets incumbents reelected, and they can raise so much more than their challengers, and so they're not going to willingly change that system. It's got to come from outside.
So this is a question I was actually, wondering this myself, that one of the things you mentioned was just simply moving when we vote, because I was aware also that many other places, I think most other countries, make it more convenient than on a Tuesday. So is there any active movement to try to change that day? I know it's constitutional for federal elections, for the national elections, but are there any efforts to move it outside of that, or?
The most that I've seen is the movement for early voting, which was adopted in a number of states in 2004 and increasingly in 2008. There was then a move after 2008 to roll it back, and in several states did roll back early voting. But I think that does hold a lot of promise. There's an interesting group that's campaigned that calls itself Why Tuesday. Most Americans don't know why Tuesday. I guess it happened to be market day, and so all the farmers were going to town on that day. And so it was kind of a holiday, an ideal day on which to vote. But there doesn't seem to be a particularly principled reason why voting needs to be on Tuesdays. So while I'm not aware of a major movement to change it federally, I certainly think it would benefit us.
We could make Tuesday a day off, too, would be another approach. Do it the other way. Well, this question is about, how about a voter's revolution and we vote them all out? Which is a possibility. That one has popular support in the room. So, again, you have focused on, these sort of more structural reforms and changes, I guess, in the power structure. But as I said, I alluded to some efforts, some good things that have happened in terms of addressing the problems of the poor. I mean, are there other things outside of that that you could see a movement to sort of help alleviate poverty? Do you see any other good things happening short of these structural reforms?
This year, 2014, is the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, and there's been some good discussion had in academic circles and others about alternate approaches. I would start by saying that although President Reagan famously declared that poverty had won the war on poverty, I'm not sure it's nearly that simple. Peter Edelman, an esteemed scholar on poverty issues, argues that were it not for federal programs which had their genesis in the war on poverty, an additional 40 million Americans would be in poverty. That would almost double the current poverty rate from the 46 or 7 million who are officially poor today. And so I think we need to start by giving credit to existing programs. Among those programs, I think there are some that have been shown to be particularly effective in the Earned Income Tax Credit, which incentivizes work. That was another surprise as I was traveling through inner cities, the number of tax offices, which are quiet most of the year, but which come January, February, long lines out the door as people go in to get their tax refund based on their work in the prior year. And it's often that tax money that allows them to catch up on bills that they've gotten behind on. maybe to fix the car or deal with some dental care for the kids, something like that. So that is, I think, one good example. I think beyond that, there are many scholars much more able to speak about programs, and I'm at pains to say whenever asked that I'm not an authority on poverty, but I do feel, as you've all heard, that we're not going to be able to systematically address it when the political distribution of power is what it is.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we've seen over the last couple of years is that people who have not traditionally talked about poverty, who are in power, in politics, have, partly I think in response to the recession, and partly, I think there has been a backlash against people who have been disdained from discussing poverty, or who are seen as not being sensitive to the needs of the poor. And so I think you've seen people like Paul Ryan come out with an anti-poverty plan. You can disagree with it, but the point is he's feeling a need to address it, as are others who have not, that has traditionally not been the focus of their policy making. So I think that's encouraging. Excuse me. I thought this was an interesting question. You focus on these structural reforms that would, to do your whole list would be a big deal. One obvious thing that, in terms of the citizenship barrier, is immigration reform as a possibility, which isn't, doing that for the reason of voting per se, but it's a path to, creating a path to citizenship. But whoever wrote this was also suggesting that you could also do things like transportation to the polls, child care at the polls, doing things to facilitate people being able to vote without doing any big structural reforms. Has there been, that was a new idea to me, of doing things that were less structural, less controversial. This wouldn't raise the hackles of people who are concerned about voter fraud, which is a legitimate concern, and those types of things. Is there work being done on those kinds of, on that path, making voting simpler for people?
Yeah. Not nearly enough, in my view, especially when it comes to public authorities. I think the assumption has been that voting is essentially a negative right. We ought not limit people, although unfortunately we do, but not a positive responsibility that the government assumes to actually try to encourage turnout. Australia has mandatory voting. You pay a small fine if you don't vote, and turnout is well over 90%. Most of our peer democracies don't have mandatory voting, but do have turnout that's systematically 70, 80%. And the kinds of activities that you describe, we do see carried out by actual campaigns. Plenty of cases where, in particular, the Democratic Party buses folks to the polls and tries to take down those barriers. But it seems to me a distant second best to have self-interested political actors trying to overcome these barriers. Certainly better than nothing, in my view, when we could so easily, through public policy, remove many of these. Busing would be an extra step, but I think if one was to extend the period of voting or have it on a weekend or a holiday, you wouldn't particularly need to worry about that. We do all sorts of transactions online. There's a good question to be asked, why aren't we voting online? So I think we see some of those activities, but they're done by third parties. And when I turned 18, received in the mail my Selective Service forms to fill out, why couldn't the government do the same when it comes to getting me registered to vote?
So I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit, but let me just ask you this. What percent, like the charts you were showing, I'm trying to recall, was there a chart that showed the propensity to vote by income level for those who are, have the legal right to vote? Taking out citizenship and felonies and living in the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, mean, is there still a lower? I know there is, but how if you have the numbers in your head, how much lower is the likelihood of someone voting if they're lower income compared to upper income, but who doesn't have a legal barrier to it?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers for you offhand, unfortunately, but I think a relevant perspective on this. There's been good work done by Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. Some massive surveys of trying to understand the reasons non-voters give for not voting. Unfortunately, they don't have an income test in their survey for 2012. What they do have, though, are unfortunately proxies for income, which is race and age and so on. And you find that people of color who are 2 to 3 times more likely to be poor than white people in this country are much more likely to say the reason they didn't vote was one of these practical and preventable barriers. Transportation to the polls, they didn't get a requested absentee ballot is actually one of the most common reasons given. Didn't have child care, couldn't get off work, things like that. Whereas white respondents, the reason they were most likely to give was they didn't approve of the candidate choices, more of a voluntary abstain. So that says to me that low-income people, again, using race as a proxy as well as age, and the skew was similar between race and age. That says to me that folks would like to vote, but they face all these silly barriers to voting, and we would probably see less of a discrepancy if not for those.
So if we change the policies in the way you describe, people wouldn't just stay home. They'd take advantage of the opportunity. So that we had some of these questions were more kind of about your personal journey. I think they're interesting. So why $16 a day?
Good question. The poverty line for an average family of 4 is roughly $24,000 a year. And I decided to be kind of average, that I would simply divide that by 365 and by 4, hence $16 a day. I also figured that maybe I could swing it for a couple weeks at a time. I should say that that didn't include my Greyhound fare. That would have been impossible. But I figure a lot of people in poverty do have shared living arrangements, so maybe if that was an extra, and I spent plenty of nights on the bus or in bus stations. But that was how I came up with 16.
And what was your biggest challenge in living on $16 a day?
My friends call me wholesome because I love to eat carrots and nuts and things, kind of like a rabbit. And I was able to, every couple of cities, I could find my way to a grocery store, and I could stock up on a couple pounds of carrots and almonds and things. And if I could get them in bulk, they were pretty cheap, about $1 a pound for the carrots, about $5 a pound for the almonds. And so my bag would be pretty heavy for a couple of days with these staples, which were a good source of energy. But partly as a consequence of not eating a very balanced diet, one of the challenges was that I was craving all sorts of things that I don't usually crave. I'm not a fast food guy, but the number of billboards that I would see on buses and on TVs, the Greyhound stations had this practice of running infomercials on loop constantly, so when I'd be trying to sleep, it'd be nothing but ads there on TV. And I was craving hamburgers like crazy, probably because of my restricted diet as well as the ads, who knows just why. So that was a challenge. And on the note of food, it was pretty hard to find those grocery stores. So I did, sometimes there was nothing but fast food. I remember doing a quick informal survey as I was riding about 20 buses down one of the busy boulevards in LA in Inglewood, south of the downtown, and I took a tally of the different establishments that I saw. The bus was stopping a lot, so I could keep track. I counted over 20 blocks. I counted 15 or so fast food restaurants, 10 to 15 liquor stores, a bunch of hair and nail salons, not a single grocery store. And that was pretty typical of the inner cities.
The food desert problem.
Right.
We have a couple questions here about the fact that a lot of these decisions are made at the state and local level in terms of policies. And are there good examples of, you mentioned in Maryland, there's a couple of cities or towns that allow non-citizens to vote. Are there other examples you'd hold out either on campaign finance or voting rights?
That's a great question. In the space of campaign finance, this model that I briefly described of a small donor public funding system for elections is being practiced in a handful of states, Maine, Arizona, and Connecticut. And in these states, it's a voluntary system. Candidates choose to opt in. They may opt out and raise private money. But they've endeavored to create the incentives so that candidates have a credible shot at raising enough money, not the most money, but enough money to get heard by opting into the public funding system. And we've seen as many as 3/4 or 80% of candidates choosing to opt in. And when they do, their whole campaign experience is reversed. Instead of spending most of their time with that fraction of 1% of major donors, and those percentages do apply at the state level too, they're appealing to a much broader constituency. The largest size donation they can accept is $100. If they raise a large number of these small checks between $5 and $100, they receive matching public funds and enough money to then run their campaign. So from that point forward, once they've raised their qualifying checks, if they want, they can continue raising small money, but generally they have enough to go out and do the kinds of things we think politicians should do in campaigns, talking to their constituents. So that's been very encouraging to see. And there have been some noticeable policy changes. I mentioned testimonies I've heard from folks from state lawmakers in both Maine and Connecticut describing their relationship to lobbyists being very different from before. The lobbyists haven't gone away. They still serve an important function, educating lawmakers about their issues. But the power they have to require the candidates go their way is no longer there. So, one lawmaker describes passing lobbyists in the hall and he can just wave at them, end of story. He doesn't need to kind of hear the latest thing they have to say.
You harken back to Michael Harrington and sort of the invisible poor. Is there something that people should be doing to make the poor less visible? I sort of connect this to something, that was the question on the card. I sort of connect this to something I was thinking about, which, I'm not, do you think the poor should be better organizing themselves? Should I saw there's the story from the 60s of the National Welfare Rights Organization, which was an organization of low-income people sort of advocating on behalf of then welfare rights. But is that how do you in a way you describe this as we're going to put a human face on democracy reforms. You could also think of it as putting democracy reforms, offering democracy forms as a solution to poverty. But both of those require people caring about poverty. So, do you have some thoughts on how, your work obviously brings it to people's attention, but do you have any other thoughts on that?
I wonder if I could answer that by giving a somewhat starker example from South Africa. As folks know, South Africa is now 20 years out of apartheid. But I would say that while South Africa negotiated a successful political transition to democracy, the economic transition just hasn't really occurred. And you see, in my experience, one of two responses on the part of more privileged people. From what I could tell, the dominant response is to remain in these enclaves, behind literally high walls with barbed wire or electric fencing at the top. And the apartheid system, I would argue, because we are all human and thus humane, couldn't have persisted for the decades it did if not for the separation that it forcibly effected. Apartheid means, in the Afrikaans, separateness, separate development. And so a lot of South Africans who can afford to live behind these high walls, often gated communities where you can't get within many meters of the home, drive vehicles with darkly tinted windows and just don't roll them down at the stoplights. I think a much smaller number of people do make a point of venturing beyond their enclaves, and you don't have to travel far at all to see something different. South Africa is the most income unequal country on earth. The U.S. is the most unequal developed democracy on earth. And I think, sadly, we are headed, the current trend is in that direction. We see gated communities rising in popularity if you can afford them here. I've noticed since returning from South Africa a year ago that the number of people I see at stoplights in Concord or Nashua or Manchester is more than I remember seeing. I don't really remember seeing people, at least in New Hampshire, which scores pretty well on the poverty charts nationwide. What we choose to do with those circumstances, whether we continue to move, given the choice, toward increasing isolation, and we see that desegregation hasn't particularly worked racially. I think it's not really coming about in economic class terms also. Do we choose, when given the choice, to live further apart or to bring our lives closer together? And I can say that's a tough choice personally. I want to live in a safe neighborhood. But I think it's something we've got to grapple with individually, because if others are anything like me, it took that more painful and immediate experience of poverty to do this work. Otherwise, I'm just a happy, abstract democracy guy. And most of my peers, for understandable reasons, are just happy earning a good paycheck and living a decent life. So are we willing to make those choices and to kind of upset our status quo through such interactions? And it can be as simple as volunteering every now and then at the soup kitchen, and doing so not just from a position of, I've got this great thing to give, but we are equally human, and maybe I can even get to know you across the counter from me. So that's something I certainly urge.
So one last thing. I guess one thing I would disagree with you that you said was, at some point you said, like, you sort of gave a litany of democratic values, small d democratic values, and said we can all agree on those things. And there were a couple of them that I'm not sure we would, everyone would agree on. And there are concerns raised, in response to some of the things you're advocating for about, in particular, voter fraud. Or what the penalty should be for committing a felony, or the constitutional, heritage of D.C. voters having special influence because they're in D.C., which is true of some people in D.C., but not everybody for sure. Or the fact that in Puerto Rico, they've had referendums. It's not like their democratically elected officials are clamoring to start paying the full U.S. income tax in exchange for becoming citizens. So, I think on some of those things, there certainly would be pushback, and not completely unprincipled pushback. And, even on campaign finance, you were implicitly critical of the equating of money to speech. But on the other hand, it seems like the reason you're upset about it is the fact money is speech, that it has an effect on political outcomes, which, was, clearly I think the First Amendment was intended to address speech as an effect on political outcomes. So I've thrown a lot at you, but, there is pushback on some of these things, and it's not, that's why these things haven't happened. It's not like, or it's at least a reason why these things haven't happened. So, what's your response to that? What's your sort of pushback on me on those things I'm articulating?
Fair points all. My claim would be that the differences we have are based much more on interests than on principle. And so at the top level, in terms of first principles as a nation, I think few, if any, would argue that demos, kratia, power to the people, everybody should have at least the ability to make their voice heard. Now, there will always be some kinds of exceptions, and maybe most Americans would say, Well, that shouldn't apply to people in prison. And I accept that. That's a very reasonable position. Or non-citizens. I think it's a useful factoid to consider that that isn't our historic practice before the 1920s. And that's not against the Constitution in that particular case. So when it comes to actually trying to put together a reform agenda, I'm under no illusions that everybody's going to agree. But I do think the majorities are there. And I'm pretty determined to try with many others, including folks in this room, the student organization Democracy Matters that works to engage college students in this, the organization Open Democracy that I direct here in New Hampshire, pretty determined to try and build a solid majority behind these issues, which I do think exists.
All right. Well, thank you. I think that's a good note to end on.